In 1993, Kody Scott wrote an autobiography that shocked the world, forever changing the way people looked at gangs in Los Angeles. His book also forever changed the way people looked at him, as after almost 30 years he is still recognized as Monster Kody from South Central. Even after changing his name to Sanyika Shakur and renouncing gang violence, his reputation as a gangster crip continues to follow him wherever he goes. Sanyika Shakur was born Kody Dijon Scott on November 13, 1963. He grew up in South Central and was raised with his 4 brothers and 2 sisters, with him being the second youngest. As a kid, Sanyika was described as being curious and smart, and never afraid to try new things. His mother thought he was going to be an artist. His mother was a hard worker, often holding down 2 jobs at a time to support the family. Sanyika's stepfather treated Sanyika differently than his siblings because he was not his biological son. Sanyika didn't know who his real dad was until he became a teenager. He learned his biological father was Dick Bass, a professional football player for the Los Angeles Rams. Dick Bass and Sanyika's mother had a brief relationship that ended soon after she became pregnant, and Dick Bass never welcomed a relationship with Sanyika. While he didn't have a good relationship with his father or stepfather, Sanyika was close to his godfather, who was the legendary Ray Charles. Ray Charles and his wife would pick up Sanyika, and he would spend the weekends with them at their house. In 1974, Sanyika was 11 years old and going to Raymond Ave Elementary in Los Angeles. Even though he was young, he was still fully aware that his school was in a gang neighborhood, his house was in a gang neighborhood, and that gangs were all around him. But even with all this, he was not actively looking to join a gang. But that all changed the day he was attacked and robbed at school for his lunch money from an older classmate. The incident immediately changed his life, and the very next day, he joined a gang. Jumped into Eight-Tray Gangsters at 11 years old and still in the 6th grade, he shot his first victim the same night he joined the gang, and from then on, dedicated his entire life to his neighborhood and to going against all his enemies. And there were many enemies. It was the mid-70s, and gangs were popping up everywhere. The memories of the Black Panther Party still lingered in South Central, and as a result, neighborhood gangs took on the strength of the Panthers, but they operated much different. The peace and unity that the Black Power movement represented was pushed out by the violence of street gangs. When Sanyika first joined Eight-Tray Gangsters, he was mentored by older members who taught him the behavior and mentality of a gang member. He learned that the gang structure closely resembled that of a military organization, with its missions, units and commands, and a hierarchy of its members. Sanyika quickly rose through the ranks. He dropped out of school and started gangbanging full-time, involving himself in everything from stealing cars and writing on walls to robberies and full shootouts with his enemies. Down the street from Sanyika's house lived Tookie, the original founder of the West Side Crips. Tookie was older than Sanyika and was a legend in the neighborhood. Many kids looked up to him, including Sanyika, who would hang out at Tookie's house while he lifted weights, or ride around the neighborhood with him listening to Tookie tell gang stories. 2 years after joining his gang, Sanyika was involved in a brutal robbery in which police labeled him a monster. His friends there at the time hyped up the idea of him being called a monster, celebrating the power of the name, and Monster Kody was born. Feeling the need to live up to the name, Monster Kody was on a whole nother level. Vicious and having no fear, he retaliated on every enemy that crossed him, or crossed anyone he was associated with. Between the ages of 13 and 15, Sanyika was arrested 3 separate times and sent to juvenile hall, rehabilitation camp, and a youth authority facility. At the age of 16, he was shot 6 times by enemy gang members after being set up by 3 girls who offered him a ride to the store. And at the age of 18, he was shot again during a carjacking gone wrong. Arrests, shootings, and even the birth of his daughter didn't slow down Monster Kody. The war in his neighborhood was at a high, and some close to him were dying because of it. This only caused him to go harder. He organized revenge missions and recruited new members to the Eight-Trays. In 1984, Sanyika was arrested on a gang-related shooting charge and sentenced to 7 years at Chino State Prison. During this first stretch behind bars, he met a man named Muhammad who was a Muslim church leader. Sanyika was introduced to Islam and began going to sermons and taking part in Islamic services. Because Sanyika had dropped out of school in the 6th grade, it was difficult to understand most of what he was reading during those first few years in prison. But he slowly taught himself how to read and write, and eventually found meaning in Islamic teachings. After serving 4 years in prison, Sanyika was released and immediately back in his neighborhood. Although he had begun a transition into a new way of thinking, it wasn't until years later that that transition would take effect. Still in his early 20s and back in the streets, Sanyika was quickly drawn back into the life of gang politics and the never-ending cycle of getting even with enemies. But by this time, drugs had flooded South Central, and Sanyika began an addiction to cocaine and PCP. During this time, he also married his longtime girlfriend, who he later went on to have 3 children with. And he continued his Islamic studies with Muhammad, who he had stayed in touch with. But he couldn't let go of his gang life. In 1991, 3 years after being released the first time, Sanyika was arrested again for assault and grand theft auto and sentenced to 7 years. This time, he was sent to one of the worst prisons in California, Pelican Bay. And because of his reputation and association with other gang members, prison gang coordinators labeled him a threat to the institution of security, meaning he would be forced to serve his entire 7-year sentence in solitary confinement. While alone in his cell for 23 hours a day, Sanyika immersed himself in Islamic readings. He began a complete personal and political transformation, moving away from a criminal mentality towards a deeper knowledge of self. He also learned Swahili and officially changed his name from Monster Kody to Sanyika Shakur, which means unifier and gatherer of his people. He remained a Crip, but now recognized the destructiveness gang members were doing to each other and the community. From behind bars, Sanyika set out to unite all Crip gangs together and reestablish the word Crip to be a positive influence in neighborhoods. He joined the CCO, a consolidated Crip organization in prison that does not support Crip-on-Crip violence or fighting against blood gangs. But after a few years, Sanyika left the CCO to further his transformation. He joined the Black nationalist New African Independence movement and renounced gang membership for revolution, dedicating himself to the freedom of New Africans. And then he wrote a book. Released in 1993, Monster, the autobiography of an LA gang member, sold 300,000 copies in the US alone and earned Sanyika over $800,000, all while he was still in a maximum security prison and in the hole. The book Monster gave a raw look into brutal gang life that at the time was being overlooked and downplayed by the media as just another problem in the ghettos. Sanyika talked openly and nonchalantly about various crimes and murders. He wrote about the remorse he felt for what he had been a part of, and that he had wrongly believed it was all to protect his neighborhood. After the book's release, Sanyika explained the intent of his book was not to glorify gang violence, but to instead show how dangerous and destructive gangs are to the Black community. He was not looking to become a gang hero or the go-to guy for gang understanding. However, that's exactly what happened. By the time Sanyika was released from prison in 1995, he was known everywhere. Sanyika's book was the first time many had gotten a look inside gang culture, and it shocked most who read it.
It's 383 pages of gore, no doubt about that. But it's reality. It happens every day.
His name was headlined in newspapers across the country, and he was asked to do numerous interviews, shows, and documentaries. But as outsiders read Sanyika's book from the safety of their homes, those living in gang neighborhoods were reading it too, except instead of being shocked, they were inspired. Younger generations respected and admired Monster Kody. They wanted to be just like him, emulating his viciousness and looking up to him the same way he had looked up to Tookie. Sanyika came to realize that with his book, he had unintentionally inspired other young men to follow in his footsteps. So over the next few years, Sanyika continued to use his platform to spread his message of not ending gangs in South Central, but ending the violence within them.
The level of shooting at each other, you gotta stop shooting at each other. Because it's not about turf, because neither one of us own nothing.
He also spoke on the new African struggle for independence, freedom, and socialism. But speaking out and being in the public eye came with disadvantages. Although Sanyika was no longer actively involved in gang activities, he still had to keep his guard up and watch his back, as that's the life of even an ex-gang member. Being in the public eye, Sanyika was also constantly targeted by the police, who watched him closely, looking for any reason to take him back to jail. Sanyika attempted to live a normal life. He spent time with his family, recorded a couple rap songs, and even became friends with Tupac Shakur. But through everything, he was unable to get his disease of addiction under control. His drug use made it hard to live a straight path and blurred the line between Monster Kody and Sanyika Shakur. His positive message of unity slowly fell quiet until it completely faded out of the spotlight. Then, in 2007, years after writing his book, Sanyika was back in the news when the LAPD added his name to the top 10 most wanted gang members list, wanted on suspicion of auto theft and assault. Many called the move harassment by the LAPD, as auto theft does not usually warrant a spot on the top 10's most wanted list. Sanyika was later arrested without incident and sent back to prison for another 6 years. During this incarceration, Sanyika took part in a high-profile prison hunger strike to protest inhumane prison conditions. The protest gained national news attention during the summer of 2011 as 12,000 inmates refused to eat, including Sanyika, calling attention to the unfair treatment of prisoners locked in solitary confinement. And during this time, Sanyika also released 2 more books. After Sanyika's latest release from prison, the courts kicked him out of Los Angeles County. Forced to live in another part of Southern California, Sanyika continues to represent South Central LA, but not as a gang member. Clean and sober, he's a new African nationalist, a revolutionary who believes in land, independence, and socialism.
Now, as karma has come around, I got to go back and make amends, which is why I started cleansing my criminal mentality and getting with consciousness. Understanding that my heart and my resources of self could better serve us as a whole as opposed to us individually as a set.
And none of Sanyika's children became a gang member. And even though gangs are still very much alive in Los Angeles, most of the gangsters from Sanyika's past have either been killed or they're serving life sentences in prison. So Sanyika continues to write and speak about finding a different way. And today, many from his neighborhood came forward saying that his words have helped them. But despite all this, Sanyika is still referred to as Monster Kody in the streets, proving that the power of his past is hard to let go. Some believe Monster Kody, the Eight-Tray Gangster Crip, will never be completely out of the picture. Others have embraced Sanyika Shakur's transformation into a conscious citizen of the Republic of New Africa. But either way, he will always be known as a California legend.